The integrative brain functions. In this lecture, we are going to consider the following sections. Localization of functions in the cerebral cortex, then speech, and finally, division of functions between cerebral hemispheres. Let's start from localization of functions in the cerebral cortex. All areas in the cortex are divided into the three types: motor areas, sensory areas, and associative areas. By now, we predominantly studied motor and sensory areas, and today we are going to concentrate on associative areas. But first, let's recall the motor and sensory areas of the brain, as well as associative remaining areas we can see here. Main functional areas of the cortex. At this picture with brighter, darker colors, primary, motor and sensory cortex areas are shown. And you see they occupy less surface area of the cortex. And paler colored associative areas take much larger areas. Look, first primary motor cortex, the precentral gyrus, primary somatosensory cortex, postcentral gyrus, little portion of the auditory cortex which is visible from outside, from the lateral surface of the hemisphere, and primary visual cortex that occupies the most posterior occipital cortex. So practically these all primary motor and primary sensory areas which can be seen at the lateral side of hemispheres, and all remaining areas belong to associative cortical areas. But again, let's consider deeper motor area. This slide should be familiar, but anyway, we need to look at this again. So, motor area. First, between the frontal lobes and parietal lobes, there is a central sulcus that divides brain into this, at least to this lobe. And behind, it is a postcentral gyrus, and anteriorly is located the precentral gyrus, which exactly is the motor cortex. This shown in red area here is the motor cortex that controls the skeletal muscles of the body. And here you see the cross-section of the motor cortex area, which is cross-section of the precentral gyrus. You see it's shown in yellow here, and the cortex also is shown in yellow beneath. And you may observe that when cross-section goes directly through this gyrus, the representation of the whole skeletal muscle of the body is for the whole body, and it starts from, if we consider lower part, it is represented in the medial part of the cortex, motor cortex. Then goes the trunk, and finally most lateral portion represents the head with its face and other muscles control. And the largest areas of the motor cortex are for control of facial expression, which means the muscles of the face, and also it includes muscles that control vocalization, the pronunciation of words. And also hand with its thumb and fingers control, also very large area in the motor cortex. Then somatosensory area, which is located in the postcentral gyrus. Here, this postcentral gyrus, which is located behind the central sulcus in the first, most anterior parietal cortex, parietal lobes. This is shown in blue color. You see, this is the postcentral gyrus. And here also the whole body is represented, but now it's not muscles, and it's not outgoing control of muscles, but the sensory input for analysis of sensations from the body, somatic sensations, somatosensory area. Here a cross-section is made through the postcentral gyrus shown in blue. And this cortex also has similar representation, with lower part of the body represented in the medial part of the somatosensory cortex, and head is represented in the most lateral part. And also certain similarity you can find here, because again maximal, the largest areas of the cortex are for analysis of sensations that come from the receptors of hand and face. Again, hand and face have greatest representation areas, but now it's a sensory representation. Then visual sensory cortex area. It's well known. Occipital lobe actually as a whole belongs to the visual cortex, but primary visual cortex is around the calcarine fissure, which is located in the most posterior part of the occipital lobe. And this is area number 17, if you remember, primary motor cortex. The adjacent areas shown in violet are number 18 and 19, which belong to the secondary visual cortex, the remaining occipital part. Then, auditory sensory cortex area. It's located in the superior temporal gyrus. Not the whole gyrus is occupied by the auditory cortex area. From outside we can see just a little portion, which is mostly hidden from view. And surrounding area is the secondary auditory cortex. But if we open the temporal lobe, you can see it goes deeper into the brain cortex, and here is the representation of receptors that come from the inner ear. And here there is a tonotopic representation depending on the frequency of sounds, pitch of the tones, and lowest frequency from sounds are analyzed in the most superior, superficial part of the sensory auditory cortex, while middle frequencies are analyzed deeper, and the highest sounds in their frequency are analyzed in the deepest portions of the auditory cortex. Olfactory sensory cortex area can be visible from the medial surface of the cerebral hemispheres, and here it's shown in yellow. This is olfactory cortex that analyzes the olfactory sensations. And then let's move to the associative cortex areas. Again, the picture of the brain cortex as a whole, and you can observe here there is a division of primary motor, primary somatic, and primary visual and auditory cortex areas, and also supplemental and secondary sensational sensory cortex and sensory, and also secondary motor cortex is shown. And all the remaining areas belong to the associative. And generally we can divide all associative areas into three parts. First part is the prefrontal associative area. It's called prefrontal because it's the most anterior portion of the frontal lobes, while most posterior is the primary motor, and a little bit less posterior belongs to the secondary motor cortex or supplemental and premotor. Second area, associative area, is very wide because it occupies a few parts of the brain. It's called Parieta Occipital Temporal associative area, very big one. And the third area is called limbic association area. So we have the three main areas for associative cortex, and they have very different functions. And let's see now the functions of these three associative cortex areas. First, functions of the prefrontal associative area. Here it's shown now in green. So let's start from planning of complex movements. It's located close to the generally motor cortex, and many types of movements can be performed without great planning because they are simple movements and they are easily automatically done. But in case of complex movements, especially when these complex movements are new, not well studied, it requires participation of voluntary thinking about it, of planning by the prefrontal associative area of the cortex. So for complex movements it's important. Then, elaboration of thoughts, generally. Of course, generally thoughts are not possible without other parts of the brain, but number one for thoughts is the frontal part of cortex. Then planning, but now planning not of simply movements, but planning of actions, planning of events, and so on. And decision making, this is also prefrontal associative area function. Working memory is a subtype of the short-term memory, when we keep in memory something just necessary for a certain stage of consideration, stage of calculation, stage of work, but only temporarily. So it's a short time but specific type of short-term memory. Also, it's voluntarily kept in mind by the prefrontal associative area. Then, motor control of speech. This is going to be discussed in much more details, but this area can be shown here. It's area which is very close to the primary motor cortex, where the control of vocalization muscles is performed. So this area, motor center of speech, has functions of construction of phrase, transfer of thought, thinking into exact words, the choice of words, construction of phrase, and program for muscles to produce necessary sounds. And so this program is given then to the primary motor cortex, and primary motor cortex sends it down to vocalization muscles. So motor control of speech is located in the frontal lobes and exactly in the prefrontal associative area. This center has the name of Paul Broca, the physician who studied this, and we'll consider later. And inhibitory control of behavior. It helps to control behavior and decide which action is suitable at the moment and which should be inhibited temporarily because it's not corresponding, not adequate for the moment. This is also important psychological function of the prefrontal associative area. See how many functions is performed by one associative area. Then we move to the next, Parieta, Occipital, Temporal associative area. Now this area is shown mostly in almost white color, but also there is big orange-brown spot in the middle, and so we'll consider what it is. First, integration of all the sensory information. You may see that this associative area is located nearby the somatosensory area. Here you see postcentral gyrus shown in blue. Then from behind it, there is the visual cortex, and nearby is the auditory cortex. And so all this sensory information normally is integrated, and we analyze not each sensation individually, but we estimate everything in combination together. And each event for us actually can be divided into portions of each sensory analyzer bringing information. But we don't do it. We estimate everything and analyze as a combination of many sensations that come in specific order, and some of them simultaneously, some in order one after another. And so all this makes for us events of our life. And this integration of sensory information is done by this associative area, predominantly exactly by this colored in orange-brown color portion. But we'll come to this. Then, posterior part of the superior temporal gyrus, exactly this part is the sensory center of speech, or it's also called Bernicke's area. And this is exactly center that combines sensory information, analyzes these, and provides our intellectual functions, Bernicke's area. And again, while considering the speech, we'll come back to this center again. Bernicke's area, all this. Then posterior parietal area. By now it was established that exactly somewhere here in the posterior parietal portion of the cortex, we estimate the spatial coordinates of the body itself and surrounding. So we can understand and perceive our location between other objects around, and we understand the location of objects. So we can keep this in our mind, and we can understand the spatial coordinates. exactly due to activity of this portion of the parietal occipital temporal associative area. Visual processing of words. This is also an important function that actually is for Bernicke's area. And visual processing supposes that the words are written. Words are written or printed. And of course, first perception, visual perception, occurs with participation of the primary visual cortex, then secondary visual cortex. But to extract the meaning of words, to understand what these symbols mean, it's necessary to the participation of the Bernicke's area. And there should be pathways that connect the visual cortex in occipital part with this Bernicke area, and then processing results in understanding of the meaning of words. Then, inferior temporal area, approximately here, is involved into keeping the images of objects and their naming. And it was established in experiments when specific techniques of visualization of the brain functioning were used, and tested persons were asked to think about certain objects, to imagine these objects, and or they were suggested objects, and naming was required. And while they were imaging these objects or they were naming objects, the corresponding area was active, was found to be active at this moment. And so this is inferior temporal area. So there are numerous functions, and some of them we are going to consider in more details. First, parietal cortex. If we come back again to the previous slide, this shown in the upper part. This object in the posterior parietal area, which controls the spatial coordinates of the body and surrounding, in green. Look now, what happens if exactly this posterior parietal cortex area is damaged? So consequences possible. Look at this picture. Such a picture can be done by a person who has severe damage, and this damage is in the left parietal cortex. How we can establish, how we can find that this is a left parietal cortex damage? Because, look, spatial coordinates of the right half of visual field come to the left parietal cortex. And exactly right half of visual field is not adequate here. You can see left side is more or less well done, while right half of visual field is entirely disproportional, and so it corresponds to the damage of the left parietal cortex. Let's see one more example. Patients are suggested to offer to make a copy of this drawing, and it enables to estimate problems that exist in case of parietal cortex damage. And you see patient's copy looks as follows. At this moment, in this case, you can observe that there is a problem with the left part of the visual field. And here it corresponds to the right parietal cortex damage, because the left half of visual field, as you can see, looks entirely not normal, not well copied from the original. You see there is no indications of hours, and the flower is not finished in this side, while the right side is more or less pretty acceptable. So this is the right parietal cortex damage. Let's see again this localization of object and spatial memory. Now you can see exactly visualizing technique, which is the positron emission tomography, that enables to find areas with highest activity in the moment. Of course, the rest of brain is also active, but it removes the basal activity, basic, and there remains shown in colors only highest activity. And here, frontal lobe is located to the right, and occipital lobes to the left side. And you see here there are two cases: spatial memory retrieval and object memory retrieval. So first case, the patient is thinking about the location of an object, And in the second case, the tested person is asked to imagine the object and name it, or to name the object that is suggested at the picture. So naming. And if you compare two pictures, they look rather similarly. Not entirely identical, but similarly. But then if they remove all coincident portions and there should remain only the difference. This lower picture shows exactly this difference. And you can observe the spatial coordinates of the body and objects located to the left side of these both pictures. You can observe this is a posterior parietal cortex. It's closer to, it's exactly posterior portion because frontal lobes are to the right side here. So this is area which understands and keeps the spatial, estimates the spatial coordinates. Then, when this person is asked to imagine object or to name the object, these visual images of objects and their names are exactly estimated in the inferior temporal cortex areas, somewhere in inferior temporal area. Then facial recognition. This is important function which is also performed predominantly by medial parts of the occipital and temporal lobes within the Parieta occipital temporal associative area. This is rather large area. Now this is view from below. You see inferior and medial portions of occipital and temporal lobes, and in color you can see here facial recognition area. This is rather large area of the brain, but it's not an easy task to recognize face because faces change due to their facial expression, due to their different mood, sometimes different age, and we still can recognize person after many years, with different hairstyle, under different angles of view and so on. And it's the task that it's hardly performed even by computers, but for our brains this task is performed rather easily. We can recognize people. So this is also function of this associative area. And functions of the limbic associative area actually practically coincide with the functions of the limbic system itself. So it's easy to memorize. Now it's again shown in green. This limbic system. It's involved into behavior formation and control, into formation of emotions and motivations. This basically coincides with functions of the limbic system, and this is cortical portion of the limbic system. Now we come to the second part of the lecture, second division, which is speech consideration. Speech is used as the second signaling system. As you know from previous lecture, humans developed, additionally to the first signaling system that is characteristic for all living creatures, we use also the second signaling system, which gives us the possibility to communicate with and to convey much more information that can be transferred by any other way. And speech gives us opportunity to study, to communicate, to talk to people that are far from us, and all this due to words. And centers of speech develop normally in the brain, in most cases unilaterally. And in most of people, about 95%, the centers of speech are located in the left side of the brain, in the left hemisphere, in most cases. When it develops in the other right hemisphere, it can be caused by different reasons, perhaps maybe some damages in the left side or so. But in most people, it's the left hemisphere, center of speech. Somehow they explain that it is explained by the way that we start to use predominantly one side of the brain from the beginning to form the speech, and gradually it becomes more and more specialized in this area. And actually there is a specialization of function between hemispheres, and the other hemisphere, right one, makes its specialization in some other directions, some other types of activity. So there is division of functions, which is going to be considered next after speech. And for the speech, taking into account how long we are studying the people, physiology, the discovery of the location of the center of speech is relatively was done relatively not long ago. It was in the end of the 19th century. See, one of the first who studied this and discovered it was Paul Broca, the French doctor. He published his conclusions on an investigation of cases of patients. Just a few patients he observed with similar damage in the brain, and they had all similar symptoms. They hardly could speak, these patients, and they all had the damages in the left side of the brain in the specific areas. And actually he was not the first who noticed this, but he was the first who published it and then attracted maximal attention, and his discovery was independent. So generally we consider that he is the person who discovered this center of speech, and center is named after him, the Broca's center. Pay attention that the stress is to the last A because it's a French name. Broca's area in the brain is the center of speech, and it's called motor center of speech. These people with if people have damage of this center, they have problem with the speech motor functions of speech. They cannot speak properly. And later, another German investigator found the other type of damage that produces problem with speech understanding. This was Carl Bernicke. See, he's a little bit younger, and actually when he found the problem with understanding of speech, he was only 26 years, and he published the result of his studies and called aphasic symptom complex. Actually, all types of speech disorders is called aphasia. But these two types, studied by Paul Broca and by Carl Bernicke, they are two opposite cases of aphasia, motor and sensory. Now we are going to consider the centers of Broca and Bernicke, motor center of speech and sensory center of speech. Motor center of speech, Broca's area, is located in the frontal lobes, adjacent to the primary motor cortex that controls vocalization. And this center also is accompanied by the other sensory center of speech, the other center, Bernicke's area. And it's located in the superior temporal gyrus, just the most posterior part. And this is sensory center, which is necessary for speech understanding. Bernicke. And so first center, motor center, is involved into word formation and control of vocalization. If to say wider, first this center enables to choose words to use for expression of thinking, of thought, then to construct a phrase, grammatically correct construct, and produce exactly the sound themselves, vocalization. So its function is wider than only simply vocalization. But anyway, this is a motor center because finally pronunciation is a result of all these processes. While the center of Bernicke, sensory center of speech, is involved into comprehension and understanding of words simply. And also the whole abstract thinking is based on functioning of this center. Because without words it's not possible to produce any abstract thinking, because when we talk about objects which are not cannot be imagined as objects, we need to use labels, words that name these phenomena, these notions and these concepts, and then we can use for any consideration of these concepts, which is abstract thinking. So generally it's much wider than only understanding of words. Practically it is a center of our intellectual functions. and it combines all the sensory information. Look, all sensory information, somatic information, visual information, and auditory information comes from the primary sensory areas through secondary sensory areas exactly to the Wernicke area for combination of this and integration and analysis. Exactly, this is a Wernicke area that makes sense of everything, and all the input of sensations is combined and analyzed finally in this center. Brain pathways. Now let's observe how it is performed. Now we have the exact understanding how the words which you hear, and then we need to speak this word, how it goes. First, if it's a spoken word, it's an auditory stimulus, and it comes first to the primary auditory area. Observe. So here in the auditory cortex, the sound of words produces activation. And then information should be transferred to the Wernicke area. Then Wernicke area analyzes the word, makes a meaning of this word, and then it should transfer information, if necessary, to pronounce this word, to speak it. Then Wernicke area sends through specific arcuate fasciculus, sends impulses to the Broca's area. Broca's area forms the program for speaking this word, for pronunciation of this word, for vocalization, and this information is sent to the primary motor cortex, which controls vocalization muscles. And then, as a result, speaking the word occurs. Let's see how it changed in case of visual perception of a word and then speaking it. So if you read the text and you need to say loudly the word which you read. So information comes to visual cortex first, as it's a visual perception of the written or printed word. So here, excitation occurs first in the primary motor cortex. Then it should be passed through specific gyrus, that is called angular gyrus. It passes into the Wernicke area. And only then the number of symbols on the paper results in understanding of its meaning. By the way, if there is a damage of this angular gyrus, which occurs not often, of course, but it can happen sometimes, and in these cases, understanding of the written or printed word is not possible. The people become simply unable to read. They understand words when they hear these words, but written or typed, printed word is not possible to understand because of damage. There is no connection between primary visual cortex and Wernicke's area. But then, from Wernicke's area, everything is the same as before. Wernicke's area should send the information to Broca's area, and then Broca's area provides information for the motor cortex to produce word by speaking it. The aphasias. Now let's consider problems when one of the centers of speech is damaged. Therefore, it depends on which center is damaged, and different aphasias develop. Speech disorders are called aphasia. Broca's aphasia. This is motor aphasia. It's a problem with pronunciation. But it's not limited only to problems with pronunciation itself. These people are, let's finish, Bernicke's aphasia. This is a sensory problem with understanding. So Broca's aphasia includes, first, of course, easy to understand, halting speech. Sometimes these people are almost unable to produce any speech. Sometimes they can produce just few words, easiest, like yes, no, and maybe some other very short and easy words. Sometimes they can produce some phrases, very primitive phrases, with just a few words, and with big intervals between each word, and each word is produced with great difficulty. This is at least halting speech, or sometimes it's almost absent speech. But the problem is wider. They also have disordered syntax and grammar. They sentences are not properly constructed according to grammar rules. They have disordered syntax, they have simplest primitive speech, like for example, if we produce English infinitives instead of normal verbs, just simplified, not properly suited, and very primitive. Any longer phrases with additional parts of the speech will be absent. But they have normal comprehension, at least. Then, Bernicke's aphasia. These people have no problem in pronunciation. It's clear their motor center of speech is not damaged, so they can fluently say longer phrases, doesn't matter which. They have even adequate syntax and grammar, because again, this is a function of the broadcast center. The broadcast center is involved into structure of phrase, proper structure, whereas words are adequately connected to each other. But otherwise, their speech can be entirely meaningless. So when they say something, they say it fluently and generally without mistakes in the grammar. But the sentence as a whole, adequately constructed, has no normal meaning. It's entirely something like bullshit. Impaired comprehension. If they hear some words, they cannot normally understand it. And their speech also, even if it's fluent and adequate in grammar, it doesn't bring any sense. So actually, Bernicke's aphasia is, as you can see, much worse, and it results in loss of personality of the person, because there's no normal brain anymore. So let's sum it up. The location of functions in the cortex areas. Now you can see all areas with designation of the, or almost all areas with designation of their main functions. Motor part, here schematically shown, of course, primary motor and secondary motor as well. Somatosensory part, visual part, auditory part, it's clear. But then, words formation, broadcast area, language comprehension and generally intelligence, Bernicke's area. Then you can see visual processing of words. Here at specific fasciculus goes from visual cortex to the Bernicke's area to produce ability to estimate the visual information, visual input for words. Then planning of complex movements, elaboration of thoughts. As you can see, not all the functions are listed here because there is no much space, but some main functions are shown. But you remember the total range of functions is wider. Then what is also shown here, the spatial coordinates of the body and surrounding, the parietal cortex, posterior parietal cortex, and inferior temporal cortex, naming of objects and their images. When it's necessary to imagine some objects, the activity appears in this area, inferior temporal area. And limbic association area, you can see again, behavior, emotions, and motivation. All these 3 points characteristic for a limbic system as a whole. So we repeated again the functions and their localization in the cortex areas. Functions of the right and left brain hemispheres. Now there is a not only difference between different areas of the cortex and their function, but generally the brain is a symmetrical structure, and right and left brain parts contain the same structures generally. But anyway, there is the difference between functions of the right and left hemispheres. There is asymmetry. Not everything is symmetrical. And also there is a dominance. Some functions are better performed by one specific hemisphere. Left and right. Maybe we start from symmetrical function. You see, olfactory information comes equally to the both right and left hemispheres. Of course, it doesn't mean that estimation finally of the olfactory information can be equally performed. There can be difference, but information comes in exactly the same. Then also left part of a hemisphere, left hemisphere, can receives information from the left ear predominantly, and right hemisphere can receive information predominantly of the right ear, so there is no cross-section. But for the vision, there is cross-section, and the left hemisphere receives information from the right half of the visual field, while the right hemisphere takes information from the left half of visual field. But nevertheless, it's still symmetrical. It doesn't matter that there is cross-section, but symmetrical, it's still symmetrical. Then, speech and writing. It's clearly the function of the left hemisphere in 95% of people. As for the right hemisphere, its ability for speech are extremely primitive and on the level of the young children, about 4 to 5 years. Primitive speech is present. Then sensory center of language and understanding of speech is also left hemisphere. So the speech and writing is the center, Broca, motor center of speech. It's located closer to, it's in the frontal lobes. And lower you can see the sensory center, which is the Bernicke center. It's located in the Parieta posterior, in the Parieta temporal occipital associative area. Then here you can have, on the right hemisphere, we have only simple language comprehension, most of people. Then mathematics and calculation. It all is related to speech, related to the second signaling system we developed. Just it includes not only words, but we use some symbols. And calculation is manipulation with ciphers, with numbers, and again, it's a part of speech actually. So also is a function of the left hemisphere. While right hemisphere is best in spatial coordinates estimation. So division of function between hemispheres. Again, let's list only symmetrical functions first. Just there is the cross-section of pathways. Left hemisphere controls the right half of the body. It's clear. Then left hemisphere produces analysis of signals from the left ear and analysis of the right half of visual field. And also there is some function which is called stereognosis, when we make a conclusion about the object by touching it and estimation of the tactile sensation without looking. For example, with closed eyes, if right hand takes an object into, we take an object into right hand with closed eyes, or is behind a certain screen that hides the visual image of the object. And just by touching, by palpation, we can decide which is the object, or at least estimate its properties. This is called stereognosis. And left hemisphere controls the right hand and gets impulses from right hand, from sensory receptors. So when we perform stereognosis by the right hand, this is a function of the left hemisphere. And symmetrically, right hemisphere controls the left half of the body, analyzes signals from the same side, right ear, and analysis of the left half of visual field due to cross-section, and stereognosis by the left hand. But of course, when we make conclusion which object is this, the conclusion cannot be limited by one hemisphere, because naturally both hemispheres are connected by the fibers called corpus callosum. And these fibers join and connect both hemispheres, and finally our brain operates as a single one structure that always can interchange information, and all conclusions are based on the function of the both hemispheres. Let's see the stereognosis. Look here, the objects are hidden by screen from the view of the tested person, and just by touching on the objects it's necessary to find something, to decide what is this. And normally recognition of objects by any hand, we can easily name the object if we understand that this is a sphere, or it's a key, or it's a pen, or something like this. And information input to one hemisphere is available for the other. Information is available for both hemispheres. But split brain. What is split brain? This is brain with cross-section of the corpus callosum fibers. So two hemispheres become separated. Of course, no one did such experiments intentionally on humans, but in the 20th century, there were many cases when it was the attempt to make such a treatment of severe epilepsy, when patients had very strong, very severe convulsions, and when the usual medicines were not helpful, then they suggested to try such a surgical operation when the corpus callosum fibers were cross-sected, partially or completely. And really this operation, this surgery was effective in great decrease, brought great decrease in the severity of epileptic seizures, and so it was a really not bad treatment. And also it did not produce any problem, visible problem for the patients. And problems was only found by intense investigations. And really, it was not such a problem that really changed their life and made it worse. But nevertheless, it was found that some abilities are lost. Observe, this is the brain which is intact, and then left and right side, and then we split this brain. And when recognizing objects by the right hand, person can name the object because information comes from the posterior, from the postcentral gyrus, where the impulses reach from the right hand to the left hemisphere. The impulses come, and this information is easily transferred to the center that allows to name this object, which is Broca's center. Of course, it also should be available for a Bernicke center, but finally, when person is asked to name the object, it's necessary to use Broca's center. And all this information is available because it's all within the left hemisphere. But if the same patient tries to recognize object by left hand, left hand sends impulses, and left hand receptors send impulses to the right hemisphere. And right hemisphere receives this information. But to answer the question, it's necessary to produce the words. Words, in most of persons, including these patients, is a function of the left hemisphere. And left hemisphere cannot get this information from the right hemisphere. And so, simply, the tested person cannot name the object because information transfer from right to the left hemisphere is not possible. So, when they recognize objects by the stereognosis by the left hand, does not allow them to name the object which they try to recognize. And numerous experiments were produced on such patients, which were a rather great number, with severe epilepsy treatment by the severing of the two hemispheres. And they were tested with experiments when images were presented only for one hemisphere of the brain. For your understanding how it's possible, let's see. Tested person looks at the screen, and in the center of the screen there's a cross, red cross. And with constantly fixed eyes, this tested person receives an image for very short time. So even if this tested person will try to move eyes to the direction of stimulus, they don't have time because it's very little time. Look at this cross in the middle, and patient constantly looks at this cross, and then for just a moment the object appears in sight and it disappears. And the tested person normally, usual tested person, can easily name these objects because information is available for both hemispheres in a healthy person. But with divided brain, divided hemispheres, when object, let's leave the object, Normally from right, if object is shown in the left side of the visual field, which means that the image of object goes to the right visual cortex. Right visual cortex normally gives the information to the left visual cortex and to the Broca's area then, and so the person names object easily. Is it cubic or sphere or so? But because Broca's area gets this information. Now let's observe what happens in case of investigation of the split brain. If the object appears in the right side of the visual field, like this picture shows, so information goes to the left hemisphere, left visual cortex. And from left visual cortex, information easily is given to the Broca's area, and then person easily names the object. Now let's observe. When object appears in the left side of the visual field, you can see that this image of the information goes to the right visual cortex, and there is no information for the left cortex. And so when person is asked what did he see, he himself, actually what he says, it comes from Broca's area. And Broca's area in the left visual cortex does not have any information about object and even about was something shown at all or not. So tested person cannot name the object and even cannot say that he saw something, because the left hemisphere didn't see anything. Even which object, not only which object, but exactly that object appeared or not. Because Broca's area doesn't have this information. So, and observe one more set of experiments when the right and left parts of the screen gave different information. Simultaneous presentation of different objects or different words in the right and left parts of the screen. Split brain, not normal. Two hemispheres are not communicating. And before showing the images or words, in our case it will be words, the patient was asked to find the object behind the screen hidden by stereognosis, to choose the same object that was shown before, and then name this object that was shown on the screen. And look, left side of the screen shows the word key, and the right side shows the word ring. And when patient is asked to find by the left hand which object was shown, he chooses key by stereognosis, because the left hand is controlled by right hemisphere, and his right hemisphere saw the word key. But when he is asked which object he has seen, the name of the object appears as, so that this is showing that the key information from right hemisphere helps to choose by stereognosis the key object, and the oral answer that goes from the left hemisphere, from the Broca's center, shows that he says that he saw ring. And sometimes it's hard for a patient himself to understand if he finds himself choosing key and his left hemisphere has nothing to know about a key, why key is chosen. He starts to find logical explanations possible, which possible explanations, why he chosen, because he has no idea actually. So it's interesting problem that appears in people with split brain. But itself it's not of great importance the problem appears, but this helps to understand the difference of functions, division of functions between hemispheres. And now let's come to this division of functions and list these asymmetrical functions. Left hemisphere and right hemisphere. Speech, clearly stated as the function of left hemisphere in most people. And right hemisphere participates in speech, but it adds something different. Itself, it understands only primitive speech. And lexical and syntactic language also is the function of left. Everything related to speech and language is the function of the left hemisphere. And participation of the right hemisphere in language and speech is emotional coloring of language. Because, one and the same word can be pronounced very differently, with different intonation, with different with hidden meaning by mood, depending on the mood of person, depending on what is going to be expressed, how many emotions are added to this word. And emotional part is the part for right hemisphere. Then, writing, also related to the speech. So everything related to speech is the function of the left hemisphere. Calculation is a part of the operation with the second signaling system. Abstract thinking based on speech. All these belong to the left hemisphere. While the right hemisphere, at first when it was found, it was considered that the left hemisphere is dominating. Of course, for logical, for abstract thinking, for speech, left hemisphere is dominating. But it was considered that it generally dominates over right hemisphere, which is somehow underdeveloped. But then later it was found that the right hemisphere performs certain functions better than left hemisphere. So it's not greatest functions for left hemisphere, but it's a predominance and distribution of functions between hemispheres. Right hemisphere is best in spatial abilities. Actually, when person needs to understand, to recall the position of some object, location of object, it's not simply the parietal posterior parietal cortex, but the right one, the right parietal posterior cortex. And when it's necessary to memorize some spatial location, it's not simply hippocampus that we are going to study as well, but it's a right hippocampus, and so on. The right hemisphere is dominant in relation to spatial abilities. Then, perception of music. Generally, music, which is not related to words itself, just exactly music, is predominantly perceived by the right hemisphere. And recognition of faces. Actually, not only faces, but generally images, recognition is the best performed by right hemisphere. But recognition of faces is much more serious task, much more difficult as compared to recognition of other pictures or something else, because faces can be different depending on many factors. One and the same person's face can be changed, but recognition is nevertheless usually performed easily and correctly. So it's also a function of the right hemisphere. Also, there is a number of experiments for people with split brain when they were shown the pictures for right side and the left side of screen, the halves of faces of different people, and when it was necessary to recognize person, and they were given the number of photo with full face, not only half, and they chosen the object, the image and a photo of face, which was half of this was shown to the right hemisphere. When it was necessary to describe by words the appearance, the face of the person, the scene, of course it refers to the speech, and so the description by words the person gave was exactly of the photo given to the left hemisphere, because the speech is the function of left hemisphere, but facial recognition of the right one. And one more example, I'd like to show the maximal participation of perception of music by the right hemisphere, and not only music. Let's see. Here you see the PET scanning images, the positron emission tomography, which shows the areas of highest activity in the brain hemispheres. You can see 3 such cases for both left and right hemisphere. And in all 3 cases there is a difference. And difference also is shown in columns of figures beneath. And so 3 types of sounds were chosen. First, sound of speech. Second, sounds of the environment, which means the nature sounds like wind, the rustling of leaves and so on. And music. And observe which hemisphere participates in perception predominantly. Beneath you see figures twice. 2 times for left and 2 times for right, because first 2 columns represent the activation in the primary auditory cortex, the so-called area number 41. And primary cortex of course, receives impulses from both right and left side equally. So for the speech, you see, 41st area gets right and left side impulses equally, because it's normally conduction of the sound. Negligible difference then doesn't make really difference. But the secondary auditory cortex, which is involved into analysis already, you see, produces difference. And for speech analysis, which is predictable, maximal activation occurs for the left hemisphere, shown in violet. Left hemisphere is activated much more, and in the upper portion of the picture you can observe greater area activation. Then, for environmental other sounds, not speech, you see, again, these sounds for the 41st area, primary auditory cortex, have negligible difference, actually not big. But for the secondary auditory cortex, difference is clear. And this difference is in favor of the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere is much more active in response to these impulse, these sounds, which belong to the first signaling system, if you remember. And analysis of the sounds of the first signaling system is mostly function of the right hemisphere. And maximal difference you can observe in the third case when music is suggested. And even picture shows that left hemisphere participation in the music perception is minimal. And figure also shows here difference is negligible and here difference is pronounced. You see, left hemisphere is almost not participating in the music perception, while right hemisphere greatest participation, and practically we enjoy music by right hemispheres. And that is perhaps almost all I wanted to say. This is the end of lecture, and I just want to remind you, using this frog, that it's necessary to use this object. Thank you for your attention.